Nobody in the palace had ever seen the king pause at a doorway. He walked through every entrance the same way, straight, without hesitation, like the doors were lucky to be in his path. Dominic Vale did not pause. He did not second-guess. He did not stand in the frame of a room and stare at the back of someone's head trying to remember whether he had ever learned the sound of that person's laugh. But he was doing exactly that now. Kalen sat at the far end of the morning room, near the tall window that caught the first good light of the day. He was reading. His shoulders were slightly curved inward, the way quiet people hold themselves when they are alone and comfortable, and believe no one is watching. A cup of tea sat beside his elbow, long cold. He had not touched it in some time. Whatever was in that book had taken him somewhere else entirely. Dominic had been standing in the doorway for almost 2 full minutes. He turned and walked away, before Kalen could look up. That was the kind of man Dominic Vale was. He noticed things, small things, important things, and then he buried them under the business of being a king. He had been doing it his whole life. He was 31 years old. He had ruled the ironclad territory since he was 23, when his father passed the seat to him not out of age or tradition, but out of a quiet acknowledgement that his eldest son had already been running things behind the scenes for 2 years. Dominic had been a serious child, a focused teenager, and a relentless young man. He collected responsibilities the way other people collected debts, steadily, without noticing the weight until much later. His advisors respected him. The people of his territory respected him. Other alpha leaders either feared him or admired him, and most of them did both. He was not a cruel man. That was something people sometimes got wrong about him. He did not enjoy other people's pain. He did not raise his voice when a quieter approach would work. He did not punish people for small errors or make an example out of someone just to prove a point. He was, by most reasonable standards, a fair and careful ruler. What he was not, what he had never been, was warm. His mother had told him once, when he was about 14, that warmth was not a quality that rulers could afford. She had not said it harshly. She had said it the way you tell a child that the stove is hot, as a practical fact meant to protect him. His mother was a careful woman who had spent 30 years beside a powerful man, and she had learned things the hard way that she tried to pass on gently. Dominic had listened. He always listened, and somewhere along the way, he had taken her practical advice and turned it into something almost architectural, a structure he built around himself so thoroughly that he no longer noticed the walls. He had an estate, a household staff of 43 people, 2 horses he genuinely liked, a library he rarely had time for, and as of 7 months ago, a mate. The mate had been his head advisor Everton's idea. No, that was not entirely fair. The idea had been practical and obvious, and had come from several directions at once. Dominic's line expected it. The territory's stability benefited from it. There were diplomatic advantages. There were personal advantages that Everton had outlined carefully in a document, which Dominic had read twice and then folded into his desk drawer. The social structure of their world placed enormous significance on the Alpha-Omega bond, not as romance, not primarily, but as a foundation, a sign of rootedness, a proof of intention to continue. Dominic had agreed. He had been presented with 3 possible matches over the course of 2 months. He had met each of them once, for about 30 minutes. The first was pleasant but visibly nervous, in a way that put Dominic on edge. The second was confident and impressive, but also, Dominic suspected, more interested in the position than in anything it entailed. The third was Kalen Reese. Kalen had arrived 20 minutes late to their introduction because he had gotten turned around in the East Wing corridor. He had apologized directly and without excessive embarrassment, explained what happened, and then sat down across from Dominic and waited. He was not performing calm. He was actually calm. He looked at Dominic the way someone looks at a person they are genuinely trying to understand, not with calculation, not with nerves, just with honest attention. They had spoken for 40 minutes. Dominic asked most of the questions. Kalen answered them simply, without trying to impress anyone. When Dominic said something that he himself found slightly amusing, Kalen smiled, not because it was polite to smile, but because something in the words had actually reached him. Dominic had left that meeting and told Everton, him. He had not examined why, with any particular care. The bonding ceremony was small and efficient. Dominic had requested it that way. Large ceremonies created expectations. and he was not a man who enjoyed being the center of attention in personal matters. He was fine standing in front of 1,000 people to give a policy address. He was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of people watching him during anything that touched the private architecture of his life. So the ceremony had been 18 people, a quiet garden, and a cold afternoon in the middle of March. Kaylin had worn a pale green jacket. Dominic remembered this for no particular reason. The officiant spoke for 12 minutes. They exchanged the formal words of the ironclad bond, words that were old, that carried weight, that people had been saying for generations in this territory. The crowd, such as it was, watched with warmth. Everton was fighting back what looked like entirely unprofessional emotion. The two horses were visible through the gate, indifferent to the proceedings. Dominic held Kaylin's hand during the final words, as the ceremony required. He let go the moment the officiant finished. They walked back to the house, side by side, and Dominic had already begun mentally reviewing the evening's briefing by the time they reached the door. Kaylin had said nothing on that walk. Dominic had not noticed. The first weeks of their shared life were defined, in Dominic's mind, by the concept of arrangement. The house was large enough that two people could live in it without disrupting each other significantly. Kaylin was assigned his own rooms in the north wing. He was informed of the general rhythms of the household: meals at 7 and 1 and 7, staff meetings on Mondays, Dominic's work hours stretching late on most evenings. He was welcomed to the estate with careful, genuine warmth by the housekeeper, a sturdy woman named Bet who had worked there for 16 years, and who gave Kaylin a full tour on his second day, and pressed a handwritten map of the corridors into his hand before he left it. Kaylin thanked her in the way of someone who meant it, and Bet liked him immediately. Dominic observed this from the entrance of the east hallway, and filed it under things he did not need to think about further. Their first shared meal was on a Wednesday. Dominic arrived at the table at 7 exactly, as was his habit. Kaylin was already seated, which surprised him slightly. They sat across from each other, and the staff served, and Dominic spoke for approximately 4 minutes about a land boundary issue in the Northern District that had been dragging on for several months, mostly because he was thinking about it, and talking helped him think. Kaylin listened. He asked one question, a good question actually, about whether the affected families had been consulted directly or only through the district representative, and Dominic paused and admitted that he was not certain, and made a note on the small pad he kept beside his plate. It was the most productive dinner conversation he had had in weeks. They sat in silence for a while after. Not uncomfortable silence, just silence. Kaylin ate the rest of his meal, excused himself quietly, and left. Dominic sat at the table for another 10 minutes with his notes. He told himself things were going well, and in a practical sense they were. Kaylin settled into the household without drama. He did not demand attention or time or conversation that Dominic wasn't offering. He found his way into the rhythms of the estate without disrupting them. He was present at the meals he was expected at. He was gracious to the staff. He answered correspondence from Dominic's social circle with more ease than Dominic ever had. When Everton met him at the first formal estate gathering, a quarterly dinner for the territory's senior council members, Everton had pulled Dominic aside afterward and said, with genuine relief, "He's good for us." Dominic had nodded and said yes, he agreed. He had not asked Everton what he meant by us. The months stacked. October became November, became a cold and gray December. Dominic worked. The territory had a difficult winter. A flooding issue in the South District required 3 weeks of his focused attention, and he barely surfaced from his office during that period. Kaylin left a tray of food outside the office door 2 evenings running, which Dominic discovered only when he stepped on it on his way to the bathroom at 11 at night. He ate the food cold. He did not go to say thank you. He told himself he would do it in the morning. He forgot. By the time January arrived, they had lived together for 4 months, and Dominic had spent perhaps 6 or 7 hours in Kaylin's direct company, not consecutive hours. Hours scattered through dinners and hallway crossings, and one evening, when Kaylin had been in the library, when Dominic went to retrieve a document, and they had sat on opposite sides of the room for 40 minutes reading in the same space, which Dominic had found, if he was being honest with himself, oddly restful. He was not, as a rule, being honest with himself. February brought a series of formal social events that required them to appear together: 2 dinners at neighboring estates, a territorial gathering, and a ceremony honoring one of the older families in the region. These events were the moments that Everton had flagged in his original document as socially significant. A bonded pair attended them together. They arrived together and left together, and were seen together, and this carried meaning in their world. Dominic managed these events with the same precise efficiency he applied to everything. He introduced Kaylin. He stood beside him when photographs were taken. He kept one hand at the edge of Kaylin's elbow when they moved through crowds, the way his etiquette training had specified. He spoke to other guests with warmth and humor. He was, when required, an excellent dinner companion, and Kaylin stood beside him and was quiet and pleasant and did everything right. At the second of these dinners, a woman named Corinda, the wife of a council member, sharp and kind in equal measure, had taken Dominic aside while Kaylin was speaking to someone across the room and said, "He watches you, you know." Dominic had looked across the room. Kaylin was listening to the other guest with full attention, not watching Dominic at all. He told Corinda she must be thinking of someone else. She had smiled at him in a way he didn't entirely understand, and gone back to her husband. On the drive home from that dinner, Kaylin sat beside him in the back of the car, and looked out the window at the dark countryside passing. He didn't speak. Dominic reviewed the evening's conversations in his head, and thought about 3 follow-up things he should do the next morning. Halfway home, Kaylin said quietly, "It was a nice evening." Dominic said, "Yes, I think it went well." And then the car was quiet again, and the lights of the estate appeared on the hill, and they went inside, and went to their separate rooms, and the house settled into the deep silence of a winter night. Dominic lay awake for a while. He was not sure why. He thought about the land boundary issue, which had finally been resolved. He thought about a letter he needed to draft. He thought about the 3 follow-up items. He thought about Corinda's smile and the particular quality of it, the kind of smile adults give when they believe they know something you don't. He was not in the habit of wondering whether other people knew things he didn't. He told himself to sleep. He eventually did. In the north wing, behind a door he had never once knocked on, Kaylin sat at the small writing desk that Bet had moved to the window so that it caught the morning light, and wrote in the journal he had been keeping since he was 17. He wrote about the dinner. He wrote about the woman in the blue dress who had told him 3 things about her garden that were genuinely interesting. He wrote about the drive home, and the dark countryside, and the way the stars had been completely invisible behind the cloud cover. He wrote, "I said it was a nice evening. He agreed it went well. I don't think we were talking about the same thing." He closed the journal and went to bed. The house breathed around him, large and quiet, and full of rooms neither of them was in. Outside, the February wind moved through the estate gardens, through the bare trees, past the window of the morning room where the sun would fall first thing, past the doorway where, 2 months from now, a man who had never learned to pause would stand for the very first time and not know what to do with what he saw. But that was later. For now, Dominic Vale slept in the south wing, efficient and unavailable, in the way of a man who has organized his life so carefully that nothing uncomfortable can find a way in. And Kaylin Reese slept in the north wing, quietly and without drama, in the way of someone who has spent enough of their life waiting that they have learned to make peace with the wait, even when the waiting costs them something they can't quite name. The estate was very still. The months were already moving. The morning Kaylin stopped saving Dominic a seat at breakfast was a Tuesday in March. It was not a dramatic decision. There was no moment where Kaylin stood back and thought about what he was doing and made a choice. It happened the way small decisions do when they have been building for a long time, quietly, almost without notice, like a door that has been swinging slowly for months and finally comes to rest in the closed position. He had been saving the seat for 2.5 months. Every morning he came to the breakfast table at 7 and sat on his side and left the opposite chair pulled out, just slightly, the way it sits when someone is expected. He did not do this on purpose, not consciously. It was just something he did, the way you hold a door an extra beat longer when you think someone is coming through behind you. Half the time Dominic came, half the time he didn't, because he had started early, or eaten at his desk, or had a call scheduled before 7. When he did come, they sat together and spoke, or did not speak, and Dominic's focus was always somewhere else, turned inward toward the next thing on his list, or toward his phone, or toward the window and whatever he was working through in his head. He was physically present. He was entirely somewhere else. That Tuesday, Kalen came to the table and pulled out his own chair and sat down and looked at the space across from him, the chair slightly askew the way it always was, and thought about it for a moment. And then he reached across and pushed it back in, flush with the table, the way you push in a chair that no one is about to use. He poured his tea. He read. Dominic came at 7:15, saw the table arranged neatly, pulled out his chair without a second thought, and sat down. He had papers with him. He read them while he ate. He and Kalen exchanged about 40 words over the course of the meal, half of which were about the weather, and then Dominic left. Kalen sat with his tea for another few minutes. He thought, this is fine. This is what it is. He thought it so many times in those months that the words had started to feel like the walls of a small room he had built around himself without realizing it. Kalen Reese had grown up in a household of 5, 2 parents, 2 older brothers, and a grandmother who had lived with them in the back bedroom and taught him to play cards and told him long, winding stories that often didn't have endings, just trails that faded out like paths in tall grass. His family was not wealthy. His father worked in estate management for a large landowner 3 towns over, and his mother ran a small alterations shop from the front room of their house. They were a busy, cheerful, slightly disorganized family who talked over each other at dinner and went to sleep with the television on and argued about small things with great energy and made up without ceremony. Kalen had been the quiet one, not the sad one. People sometimes confuse those two things. He liked quiet. He liked to read. He liked to think. He liked long conversations that went somewhere neither person had expected. He was not the kind of person who needed noise around him to feel alive, but he had grown up in a house where people looked at each other, where you could say something small and have someone catch it, where presence was a given. Moving into the estate had been a very different education. He had known, going in, what the arrangement was. He was not naive. Dominic had been clear in their initial meeting, not unkind, just clear. This was a practical bond, a good match on paper, an arrangement that served both of them and the territory they were part of. Dominic had not pretended it was something else, and Kalen had respected that honesty, even as something in him had held on to the ember of possibility, that in the actual living of it, something might grow. People changed in proximity. You learned each other. Small moments accumulated. He had told himself all of this in the early weeks. The months had taught him to be more precise about what he was telling himself. What he was learning, in those months, was a very specific kind of loneliness. Not the loud kind, not the kind where you cry or rage or make anyone else aware. The quiet kind. The kind that lives in small moments that other people would not even notice. The kind you feel when you say something to someone, and they hear the words but not the thing underneath them, and you watch their eyes move on, and you think, right. Okay. He had started reading more. Not because he was sad, exactly. Reading had always been his place. But because books were reliable in a way that the rest of the house was not. A book stayed. It waited. When you put it down and came back, it was exactly where you left it, and it picked up where you had been, and nothing had moved on without you. He had also started walking the estate grounds in the early evenings. There were good paths through the old garden, a little overgrown, the way things get when the people in charge of them are busy with other things. And in March, the first things were beginning to come back. Small points of green pushing up through the dark ground, a few crocuses along the south wall, the kind of beginning that was easy to walk past if you were not paying attention. Kalen paid attention to them. He learned the names of the staff, all 43, within his first 6 weeks. Not because he was strategic about it, because people interested him, and knowing a person's name was a basic form of respect that cost nothing. Bet, who ran the household with a capable and cheerful firmness, had become something like a friend. She had a sharp sense of humor and a talent for observation, and she told him things about the estate's history that nobody had thought to put in any official document. She told him about the garden's original design, and the family who had planted the south wall roses 3 generations ago, and the small door in the east corridor that no one used anymore because the room behind it had been repurposed, and the door just never got removed. Kalen had found the door and gone through it, and found a small, forgotten sitting room that had good light in the afternoons, and a slightly damaged armchair, and a window that looked out at the old garden. He had asked Bet if anyone would mind if he used it. She had looked at him for a moment with an expression that was hard to read, something between amusement and something softer, and said, No one has been in that room in years. Go ahead. He went there on the afternoons when the light was right. He brought his books and his journal and his cold tea, and sat in the armchair, and was quiet in a way that felt chosen rather than imposed. He did not tell Dominic about the room. Not because he was hiding it. Because it simply never came up, and because the kinds of things Dominic asked about in their conversations were practical things, events coming up, letters that needed responding to, whether Kaylin had any concerns about the quarterly council dinner. Good questions, useful questions. The questions of someone managing an arrangement carefully, not the questions of someone wondering who you were. Kaylin understood the difference, and he tried not to hold it against Dominic. He tried very hard. He reminded himself that Dominic was not a bad person. The evidence of this was everywhere if you looked. The staff were treated well, not with excessive warmth, but with fairness and consistency, and a basic dignity that spoke of a man who had thought about the people around him at some point, and made decisions. He paid them well. He noticed when something was wrong. He had, twice, quietly intervened in situations involving staff members with personal difficulties, in ways that Bet described to Kaylin with something close to reverence. He was not a bad person. He was just absent, in the way that some people are absent even when they are standing in front of you. The way a lamp in a room can cast light without warming anything. There was one evening in late March that Kaylin thought about for a long time afterward. It was a Saturday, and for once Dominic did not have anything demanding his attention in the evening. He had come to dinner in a lighter mood, not cheerful, exactly, but present in a way he was not always present. He had asked Kaylin about a book he had seen lying on the hallway table that morning, and Kaylin had told him about it, a history of a particular trade route, and the communities that had built up along it over 3 centuries, and Dominic had listened with what seemed like genuine interest. He had asked questions. He had offered a thought of his own that was actually perceptive. They had talked for 20 minutes about something that had nothing to do with the territory or the estate. After dinner, they had moved to the sitting room without planning to, because the conversation had kept going, and Kaylin had ended up telling a story about his grandmother and the card games she used to play with him, where she would change the rules mid-game if she was losing, and then argue that the new rules had always been the rules, and how the entire family had collectively agreed to let her win, because the alternative was a very long evening. Dominic had smiled, not politely, actually smiled, the kind that reaches the corners of the eyes and stays a moment past when the polite version would have ended. Kaylin had noticed the difference. He had thought, here he is. They had sat there for another hour, and the conversation had wandered and doubled back, and at some point, Dominic had leaned back in his chair in a way that looked almost relaxed, and Kaylin had thought, very carefully, that maybe the small ember was still going after all, that maybe this was how it would happen, slowly, in moments stolen from the routine, one real conversation at a time. And then Dominic's phone had made a sound, and he had glanced at it, and the evening closed behind him like a curtain. He apologized. He said it was something he needed to look at tonight. He said it was a good evening, and he meant it. And then he was gone, and the sitting room was just a room again, and Kaylin sat in it alone for a few minutes before going upstairs. He wrote about that evening in his journal. He wrote about the smile that reached the corners of the eyes. He wrote, I think he is in there somewhere. I think the person I sat with for that hour is the actual person. I just don't know how to reach him except by accident. He also wrote, I am getting tired of waiting for accidents. He did not write this with bitterness. He wrote it the way you write a true thing, when you have finally decided to be honest with yourself on paper. It was information. He was someone who valued information, who preferred to know the shape of a thing clearly, rather than hold on to a blurry version, because the blur was more comfortable. The shape of this thing was becoming clear. He kept walking in the evenings. He kept reading in the small forgotten room. He kept talking to Bet and learning the estate, and showing up to the meals and the events and the things that were required of him. He was not performing. That would have been easier, in some ways. He was just living inside the life he was in, with as much genuine attention as he could manage, because he did not know how to do it any other way. But he had stopped saving the chair, and he had stopped watching the door. And somewhere in the north wing, in the small writing room with good afternoon light, his journal was filling up with the careful private record of a man who was paying attention to everything, to the small green things coming up through the dark ground, to the history in the walls of an old estate, to the face of a man who could, on a good Saturday, smile in a way that reached his eyes. And who was gone again by 9 o'clock. One morning in April, Kalen was in the garden on his early walk when he heard Dominic's voice through an open window on the ground floor. Not the words, just the voice. A low and measured sound that meant he was on a call. It was not unusual. What was unusual was that a few minutes later, as Kalen rounded the corner of the south wall, he almost walked directly into Dominic, who had come out through the side door without his coat, and was standing in the early morning cold, phone pressed to his ear, and he looked up, and saw Kalen, and something passed across his face that Kalen could not quite read, before Dominic nodded briefly, and turned his attention back to the call. Kalen kept walking, but he thought about that look for the rest of the morning. He could not name it. It was not surprise, not exactly. It was something closer to recognition. The look of a person seeing something they have forgotten to notice, and noticing it now. He turned it over in his mind while he made his tea, while he read, while he sat in the small room in the afternoon light. He did not know what to do with it. He had learned, by then, that the gap between a look and an action in Dominic's world was wide enough to disappear into. So he put the look away, in the same place he put all the other small, careful observations he had made in these months. Not discarded, but held loosely, the way you hold something fragile, that you are not sure will survive the day, but that you want very much to keep. The dinner where everything changed was not the most important dinner Dominic Vale had ever attended. In fact, by the standards of his schedule, which regularly included meals with regional leaders, territorial councils, and the occasional visiting dignitary with a full ceremonial entourage, this particular evening was relatively modest. It was a joint gathering hosted by two neighboring Alpha families, the Aldreds and the Caraways, people Dominic had known since childhood, in the distant way of families who operate in the same circles without ever becoming truly close. There were perhaps 40 guests. The food was good, the wine was better, the conversation moved, as it always did at these events, between the public and the personal, in ways that required a certain amount of social navigation. Kalen had worn the gray suit. Dominic had noticed. He noticed the suit in the way he noticed most things about Kalen's appearance, briefly, factually, and then tucked away into the part of his mind that he didn't revisit. The suit was a good one. Kalen wore it with the ease of someone who had learned that clothes were tools and had selected this particular tool correctly for this occasion. They had arrived together. Dominic had placed his hand at the back of Kalen's elbow as they entered, the way he always did at these events, and Kalen had moved with him into the room without leaning in or drawing back, maintaining exactly the amount of space between them that they always maintained. The evening had proceeded normally. Dominic was placed at the main table between Edwin Aldred, who was 80 years old and had opinions about soil drainage that he expressed with great enthusiasm, and a woman named Priscilla Caraway, who was 45 and clever, and who had run her family's entire financial operation for 12 years, while her husband did ceremonial duties and gave speeches. Dominic liked Priscilla. She spoke plainly and laughed at real things, and did not require the kind of careful social maintenance that some guests needed. He found their conversation easy. Kalen was placed several seats away, near the center of the table. Dominic was aware of this in a peripheral way. He was not tracking Kalen across the table. He was engaged with Edwin's drainage concerns, and Priscilla's dry observations, and the general business of being a present and useful guest at someone else's dinner. But at some point, it was after the second course, he thought, though he was not entirely certain. He had glanced down the table and seen something. A visiting delegate from the Eastern Territory, a man named Fletcher, tall, relaxed, with the easy confidence of someone who had always been invited to rooms like this one, was leaning toward Kalen and speaking with real animation. Not the formal animation of professional conversation, the comfortable kind. And Kalen was listening, his head tilted slightly the way it went when he was genuinely interested, and then Kalen said something back, and Fletcher laughed, a full, unguarded laugh, and Kalen's mouth curved upward in response, not the diplomatic smile he used in professional settings, but the actual one, the one that moved slower and stayed longer. Dominic looked back at Priscilla. He agreed that yes, the proposed bridge expansion was probably going to create more traffic than it solved. He did not look back down the table. But something in his chest had done a thing he could not immediately categorize. It was not a large sensation. It was more like the feeling of reaching for something in a familiar spot and finding it slightly moved, a small displacement that you would not have noticed at all if you had not been expecting things to be where they always were. The third course arrived. It was during the transition between dinner and the after-dinner portion of the evening, when the guests moved from the table to the reception rooms with their drinks, and the conversations became less structured and more honest, that the thing happened. Lord Dunmore, the visiting head of a delegation from the Northern Alliance, was a man of about 65, who had been in diplomatic circles long enough that he understood exactly how much he could say, and to whom, and under what social conditions. He found Dominic near the fireplace and they spoke about some shared concerns regarding Northern trade agreements for several minutes. And then Dunmore, who had excellent peripheral vision and had clearly been watching the room with the practiced ease of someone for whom observation was a professional skill, said, "Your Omega is well liked." Dominic followed his gaze. Kaelin was across the room, speaking to 3 people simultaneously. Priscilla Caraway, a young woman named Diana who worked in land administration, and an older gentleman Dominic recognized as a retired council advisor. He was holding his glass and listening to all 3 in a way that managed to be genuinely attentive rather than divided, his face calm and open, and as Dominic watched, Priscilla said something, and Kaelin turned to her with a response that made the advisor laugh, and Diana nod energetically. Kaelin was good at this, Dominic realized. Not performing it, actually good at it, the kind of social ease that came from someone who found people genuinely interesting, rather than professionally necessary. He had not fully understood this before. He had observed that Kaelin was pleasant, and that people responded to him well. He had not understood that pleasant was not the right word. The right word was something more substantial, present maybe, or engaged, the kind of person who, when they were in a room with you, actually seemed to know you were there. Lord Dunmore was watching Dominic watch Kaelin. Dominic turned back to the trade agreement. Later, much later, after the dinner had concluded and the drive home was done, and they had come through the front door, and the staff had dimmed the lights for the night, Dominic stood in the entrance hall for a moment, while Kaelin moved toward the staircase, and on some impulse he could not entirely account for, he said, "I thought the evening went well." Kaelin stopped on the second stair and turned. He looked at Dominic with an expression that was perfectly even and perfectly polite, and that contained, behind the evenness, something that Dominic could not read. He said, "Yes. It was a nice gathering." Dominic said, "Dunmore mentioned you. He said you were well liked." Kaelin looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "That was kind of him." And he turned and went upstairs, and Dominic stood in the entrance hall listening to his footsteps until they stopped and a door opened and closed in the north wing. He did not know why he felt like he had failed some test he hadn't known he was taking. He went to bed. In the north wing, Kaelin sat on the edge of his bed for a moment before reaching for the journal on the nightstand. He opened it and found his pen and sat with it for a while without writing. Then he wrote, "He told me Dunmore said I was well liked. I don't know why he told me that. Maybe because he thought I'd be pleased. Maybe because it was safe, a compliment that came from someone else, so it didn't cost him anything." He stopped. He looked at what he had written. He crossed out the last sentence, not because it was wrong, but because he did not want to become the kind of person who kept score. He wrote instead, "I am tired this evening, that is all. I am just tired." He closed the journal and went to sleep. What happened next was not a single event but an accumulation. The way a crack in a wall begins with something small, and then the cold gets in, and the cold makes the crack slightly wider, and then the next season brings more cold, and by the time anyone thinks to fix it, the damage is no longer just the crack. Kaelin stopped going to optional events. This was the first visible crack. He attended what was required. The events where his presence was a matter of the bond's social obligations. The things where his absence would have been noticed and commented on, in ways that would create complications. Those he attended, and he did so with the same grace and competence that he brought to everything. But the things that were optional, the small social engagements, the evenings at the neighbors, the quarterly dinners with the younger tier of the council's families, those he began to decline. He was always polite about it. He had a reasonable excuse. He was not making a scene. He was just not going. Everton noticed. Everton noticed everything. He mentioned it to Dominic in a roundabout way during a Monday briefing, something about the upcoming Aldred gathering and whether Kaelin would be joining. Dominic said he assumed so. Everton said, gently, that Kaelin had declined the last 3 optional engagements. Dominic said he had not realized. Everton said he understood, but thought Dominic might want to be aware. Dominic said he would look into it. He did not look into it. He told himself that Kaelin was an adult who managed his own schedule, and that optional meant optional, and that there was nothing in the arrangement that required either of them to attend social events beyond what was formally expected. This was true. It was also, as Dominic almost noticed and then chose not to, a way of not looking at something that deserved to be looked at. The bond between them, that alpha-omega thread that was not mystical so much as deeply human, a thing built out of proximity and shared attention, and small accumulated acts of noticing, had been thinning for months. Dominic could feel this in the way that you feel the temperature of a room change before you consciously register that you are cold. A background awareness that something was different from the way it used to be, which he kept turning away from, because he did not have a useful response to it, and he was not a man who sat comfortably in things he could not do something about. The night that cracked everything open was a Thursday, in late April. It was a state dinner. Not a large one, a formal meal for a delegation from the Southern Alliance, 10 visitors, a select group of Dominic's own senior people, a total of perhaps 22 around the table. It was the kind of dinner that Dominic handled easily and well. He was at his best in these settings, controlled, focused, sharp, warm in the way that served a purpose. Kaelin was across the table, 2 seats down from the delegation's lead figure, a dignified older woman named Maribeth Oslo, who had been in diplomacy for decades, and who had an exceptionally good eye for people. About 40 minutes into the meal, Maribeth had turned from her neighbor and addressed Dominic across the table with the easy confidence of someone who assumed she had the right to ask, "And how long have you and your Omega been bonded?" Dominic said, 7 months now. She had looked at Kaelin with warm curiosity and said, "And how are you finding it? The territory? The estate?" Kaelin had smiled and begun to answer, something genuine and thoughtful, because Kaelin's answers were always genuine and thoughtful when you asked him a real question. And then Maribeth had turned back to Dominic and said, "You must be very happy." Dominic had glanced across the table at Kaelin, a quick, automatic glance, the kind that didn't linger, and said, "The arrangement has been a good one." A small silence. Maribeth had smiled, but it was the careful smile of someone who had just registered something and was deciding whether to say anything about it. She decided not to. The conversation moved on. Kaelin picked up his fork and ate. His face had not changed, not in any way that a room full of diplomats and social observers would have noticed. But Dominic, who happened to be watching at that exact moment for reasons he could not have explained, saw something. A small, barely there stillness, the kind of stillness a person goes into when they have just been confirmed in something they were hoping was not true. The arrangement has been a good one. Kaelin had not looked up from his plate. The dinner continued. The delegation was pleased. The conversation moved through the various required topics with efficiency and good feeling. Dominic performed the role that he was genuinely excellent at, and the evening was a success. On the drive home, Kaelin sat beside him and said nothing. Not the comfortable nothing of someone who was simply quiet. The particular nothing of someone who had run out of a specific kind of energy. When they arrived at the estate, Kaelin said goodnight in the entrance hall and walked upstairs without turning back. His footsteps were even. The door to the north wing opened and closed. Dominic stood at the bottom of the staircase. He thought, "The arrangement has been a good one." He heard the words as if from a slight distance, the way you sometimes hear your own voice playing back and think, "That was not quite what I meant." Except he was not sure what he had meant. He was not sure he had been reaching for anything other than accuracy. He was not sure what accuracy meant. In a room full of people, when someone looks at 2 people and asks if they are happy. He went to his office. He had correspondence to read. There was always correspondence to read. The territory did not stop requiring attention, because a dinner had gone in an unexpected direction. He sat at his desk and worked, and the house was quiet around him, and at some point after midnight he stopped working and sat for a moment in the quiet. The bond pulled at him, thin as a thread, faint as smoke, but there. He did not follow it. He went to bed. And in the north wing, Kaelin Reese did not write in his journal that night. He lay on his back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and said nothing to no one, and let himself, quietly and without drama, feel the full weight of something he had been trying not to name for months. A door was closing. Not with a slam, not with anger. Just closing. Slowly, as doors close when the person walking through them does not look back. The first person to say anything out loud was Bet. She said it on a Wednesday morning in May, in the kitchen, while Kaylin was helping her sort through a delivery that had arrived short by 3 items and required a letter of complaint to the supplier. They were standing at the long kitchen table, checking jars against a list, and Bet said, without looking up, in the tone of someone making an observation about the weather, "He doesn't see you, does he?" It was not a question. Kaylin did not answer immediately. He checked another jar off the list. He set it aside. He thought about the various ways a person could respond to a thing like that, and he chose the honest one, because Bet was the kind of person who deserved honesty and would see through anything else. He said, "I don't think he's looked closely enough to decide." Bet made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement. She crossed another item off the list. After a moment she said, "He's a good man. I've worked here 16 years, and I know what bad men look like. He's not one." Kaylin said, "I know." She said, "But good and present are 2 different things." Kaylin said, "Yes, they are." They finished the list. The complaint letter was drafted. Bet made them both tea without asking, and they drank it standing at the window, looking out at the kitchen garden where the spring things were coming along in their patient, indifferent way, and neither of them said anything else about it. But the conversation sat with Kaylin all day. Good and present are 2 different things. He had known this, of course. He had been living it for nearly 9 months. But there is a difference between knowing something and having it said aloud in a warm kitchen by someone who has been watching carefully enough to see it, and the difference is that once it is said, you can no longer hold on to the version of things where it might not be true. He stopped watching the door. Not all at once, not with decision or drama. It was another of those gradual things, the kind that you notice in retrospect rather than in the moment. He stopped positioning himself in rooms where Dominic was likely to enter. He stopped leaving the books he was reading on the hall table, where Dominic sometimes picked them up and asked about them. He stopped lingering at the breakfast table past 7:15. He was not doing any of this as punishment. He understood, somewhere in the clearer part of his mind, that Dominic was not even fully aware of these small habits that Kaylin had formed around him, these small accommodations he had made to try and close the distance, these tiny bridges he had been building in the only directions available to him. Dominic had not asked for any of them. Dominic would not notice their absence. That was the thing. Dominic would not notice. What changed, in May and June, was something structural. It was the difference between a person who is waiting and a person who has stopped waiting. From the outside, both people can look almost identical. Both go through the motions, both show up, both say the right things. But on the inside there is a profound difference. The way a building looks the same right up until the moment the load-bearing thing shifts, and then suddenly the whole shape of it is different, even if the facade has not changed yet. Kaylin was still there. He was still kind and gracious and competent, and everything that the arrangement required. He still sat across from Dominic at dinner when Dominic came. He still attended the necessary events. He still smiled at the right moments, and answered the right questions, and moved through the space of their shared life, with the same quiet grace he had always brought to it. But something inside him had turned away. Not toward anyone else. Not toward anything dramatic. Just inward. Back toward himself. Back toward the garden walks and the forgotten room with the afternoon light and the journal and Bet and the books that stayed where you left them. Dominic noticed that Kaylin was different, in the same way that you notice when a room you spend a lot of time in has been slightly rearranged. A vague sense of displacement. A wrongness you cannot immediately locate. A thing that pulls at the edges of your attention, without presenting itself clearly enough to address. He noticed this in June. He had been aware, in some background way, that conversations at dinner had gotten shorter. He had been aware that when he came into a room where Kaylin was, Kaylin did not look up with the slight attentiveness he used to. These were very small things. He had filed them in the category of not significant. But one evening in June, coming back late from a meeting in the East District, he had come through the front door at nearly 9 o'clock to find the house quiet and the ground floor mostly dark, lights burning only in the back study, where he usually worked. And he had stood in the entrance hall for a moment and felt the size of the house in a way he did not usually feel it. It was large. It had 43 staff members, and it was still large. It was large in the particular way of a place where a person lives alongside someone else, without either of them touching the shape of the other's life. He went to the study. He worked for another 2 hours. He went to bed. In the north wing, Kaylin was reading. They shared the house without sharing anything. The quarterly council dinner arrived in the second week of June. This was a formal event, not optional, not casual, and one of the 3 or 4 gatherings in the year where Dominic's household was visible in a complete and deliberate way. The council members and their partners, Dominic's senior staff, a few selected guests, 60 people, a full formal evening. Kaylin dressed with care, not with anxiety, with the competence of someone who understood the event and knew what it required, and met those requirements without fuss. They stood together in the entrance hall before the guests arrived, which was a traditional moment in the estate's hosting ritual, a show of shared welcome. Dominic stood beside Kaylin, and they looked, to every single person who arrived in the next hour, exactly like what they were supposed to be. Everton arrived early, as he always did, and he stood with them for the first few minutes, and then moved to greet the incoming guests and manage the flow of the evening. But before he moved away, he had looked at both of them, a long, careful look, the look of a man who had worked beside Dominic for 8 years, and who had arranged this bond with the full weight of his professional judgment, and who was now, quietly and privately, beginning to worry about what he had arranged. Kaylin had caught that look. He had not said anything. The dinner itself went smoothly. Dominic was at his best, engaged, sharp, authoritative in the way of someone who genuinely knew what he was talking about, and did not need to perform it. Kaylin sat at his left and was excellent, and said the right things, and laughed at the right moments, and by any external measure, was a credit to the household and the bond. But there was a moment. About halfway through the meal, one of the council members, an older man named Gerald, who had been around long enough to say things that other people only thought, had leaned across the table toward Dominic and said, "Kaylin tells me he has been learning about the territory's agricultural history. New things about the South Valley drainage system I did not expect from someone new to the region." Dominic had looked at Kaylin, not with the quick automatic glance, actually looked, for a moment, with something that was almost surprise. He said, "I did not know you had been studying the territory." Kaylin said, evenly, "You have not asked." The table moved on. Gerald made another comment. Someone else responded, and the conversation rolled forward the way it does at large dinners, where no single moment is allowed to be too heavy. But those 3 words sat in the air between them for the rest of the evening. You have not asked. Not accusing, not angry. Just true, in the way of something that has been true for a long time, and is finally being said plainly. Dominic looked at his plate. He thought about the months. He thought about the 43 staff members whose names Kaylin had learned in 6 weeks. He thought about the questions Kaylin had asked him in those early months. Careful, genuine questions. And the answers he had given, and the questions he had not asked back. He thought about the agricultural history of the South Valley, which he himself had studied at some point in his education, and which he had never once thought to mention to the person who shared his house, and his table, and his life. He had not asked. It was such a simple thing. He had not asked. After the guests left, and the staff had cleared, and the house had settled, Dominic went to the study as usual. He sat at his desk. He did not open any of the work in front of him. He sat with the quiet for a long time, which was not something he usually did. He thought about asking. He thought about the fact that the asking was still possible. That Kaylin was upstairs in the north wing, and the house was still the same house, and the bond was still there, thin and pulled but still there. He thought that he could go upstairs right now and knock on a door he had never knocked on, and start, finally, asking. He thought about this for a long time. And then some deeply ingrained part of him that he could not fully name, the part of a man who had kept his distance so long that proximity felt like vulnerability, who had organized his life so that nothing could surprise him, who moved through the world with his hands behind his back because reaching out had never once been part of the plan. That part said, "Not tonight. Not right now. There will be another time." He turned to the correspondence on his desk. There is always more correspondence. In the north wing, Kaylin had come upstairs and gone to the window and stood looking out at the dark garden for a while. He thought about those 3 words. He had not planned them. They had simply arrived, the way things do when you have held them in long enough that they slip out before you can stop them. He did not regret saying them, but he felt the specific tired feeling of a person who has said a true thing and is now waiting to find out whether it made any difference. He waited. The house was quiet. After a while he turned from the window and got ready for bed and lay in the dark and listened to the sound of the estate settling around him, the old wood contracting in the cool night, the distant sound of the wind in the garden trees, the particular silence of a place where two people are awake and alone in separate wings of the same building. He closed his eyes. He thought, I am still here. I wonder if he knows that. The woman who changed things did not arrive with any intention of changing things. She came to the estate on a Tuesday, in late June, sent by the Regional Health Network as part of their quarterly wellness check rotation. Her name was Sura. She was 62 years old, with gray hair cut practically short, and an unhurried manner that put you at ease without trying to. She had been a healer for 35 years. She had learned, in that time, the particular skill of listening to what people said, and also to what they did not say. She was supposed to be at the estate for 2 days. She stayed for 7. This was because of the state of Kaylin's iron levels, which were low enough to require a specific course of adjustment that Sura did not trust to instructions alone. Dominic was told in the Monday briefing, factually and without particular emphasis. He said, make sure he has whatever he needs. He did not go to check on Kaylin himself. This was not heartlessness. It was the specific blindness of a man who had decided, without ever saying so out loud, that personal matters were handled by other people, that the household staff and the health network and the various competent professionals he employed were the appropriate channels for personal things, and that his own direct involvement in them was neither necessary nor particularly wanted. He believed this sincerely. He was wrong about it in ways he had not yet understood. Sura spent the first morning doing what she was there to do: a full assessment, measurements, a careful review of sleep and meals and activity. Kaylin answered her questions with the candor of someone who had never seen the point of lying to a health professional. She made her notes. She adjusted the treatment plan. And then, because she was Sura, and because she had done this for 35 years, she made them both tea, and asked him to tell her how he was actually doing. Kaylin looked at her for a moment. She met his eyes steadily and waited. He said, I am well enough. She said, I did not ask about enough. I asked about actually. He laughed. It surprised him, not the laugh itself, but the way it came, fully, without the slight reserve that had become his default in this house. Just a real laugh, the kind that happens when something has actually caught you. Sura smiled and poured the tea. What followed, over the next several days, was the strangest and most relieving experience Kaylin had had since moving into the estate. Sura was not a therapist, and she was not a friend exactly. She was something more like a witness, someone who was present without agenda, who asked questions because she wanted to know the answers, who listened to the answers and responded to what was actually in them, rather than to some version of them that was easier to deal with. They talked about the estate. They talked about his family, his grandmother's card games, his brother's noise, the small alterations shop and the way his mother hummed while she worked. They talked about books, and the small forgotten room with the afternoon light, and the garden in its spring emergence, and what it was like to be in a place that was very beautiful, and very large and very quiet. On the 3rd day, Sura asked, Are you lonely? Kaylin said, That is a strange question for a house with 43 staff members. Sura said, Yes, it is. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I am not sure lonely is the right word. It implies something is missing. I think what I feel is more like present in a room where no one else is facing the same direction. Sura was quiet too for a moment. She said, That is one of the most precise things I have heard anyone say about this particular experience. He looked at her. She said, I have worked in a lot of households, a lot of bonds, the practical kind, good paper, good sense, good terms, and what you just described is common in those arrangements, and also hard, even when you know what you walked into. He said, I did know what I walked into. She said, knowing and feeling are different things. He looked out the window at the garden. He said, Yes, they are. It was on the 4th day that Kaylin laughed for the 2nd time. Sura had been telling him about a patient, years ago, who had tried to treat his own ankle injury using a method he had read about in a book from the 1700s, and the description of what had followed was so vivid and absurd that Kalen had put down his tea and laughed until his eyes watered. A member of the household staff happened to be passing the corridor outside the room at that moment and, naturally, mentioned it to Bet. Bet filed it. She did not immediately do anything with it. But somehow, in a house of 43 people, things travel the way they do. By Friday morning, Dominic had been told, in a roundabout way, that Kalen had laughed in the sitting room. Dominic said nothing about it. He went to his meeting. He thought about the sitting room. He thought about the last time he had heard Kalen laugh, genuinely, not politely. It took him longer than it should have to remember. He went back through the months. The Saturday in March, the grandmother's card games. That had been 3 months ago. He had not made Kalen laugh since then. He was not certain he had tried. He was not certain he had been present enough in their shared hours to have had the opportunity. He sat in his meeting and listened to the agenda and contributed where he should, and managed the entire thing with his usual competence. And underneath all of it, he was doing something he rarely did, which was looking at a thing directly and making himself stay with it rather than turning away. He had not heard Kalen laugh in 3 months. A woman who had been there for 4 days had managed it twice. What does that say? Dominic asked himself, in the part of his mind that he kept very private. He did not answer immediately, but he did not turn away either. On Saturday, the day before Sura was due to leave, Dominic came home earlier than usual. He came through the side entrance, the one that led through the garden corridor, and he heard voices ahead. 2 voices, Sura's, measured and warm, and Kalen's, which had a quality in it that Dominic stopped to locate before he could move forward. Ease. That was the quality. Uncomplicated ease. The sound of a person in a conversation they were not managing or performing or maintaining. Just in. Dominic stood in the garden corridor and listened for a moment, without meaning to. Not to the words. They were talking about something to do with a bridge and the construction that had narrowed it. Nothing consequential. He listened to the quality of Kalen's voice, the weight of it, the way it moved. He thought, I have never heard him sound like that with me. He thought, I have never given him a reason to. He moved on before they heard him. He went to his study. He sat at his desk and did not open any of the files on it. He sat for a long time. Sura left on Sunday morning. She shook Kalen's hand with both of hers, a warm, deliberate gesture, and said something quiet to him that Dominic could not hear. Kalen nodded. He looked lighter than he had in months. Sura turned and shook Dominic's hand with the same steady grip. She looked at him with the direct, unhurried gaze of someone who had been paying attention all week and had arrived at some conclusions. She said, "He is a remarkable person." Dominic said, "Yes." She said, "Make sure you are paying attention to that." She smiled, picked up her bag, and walked to the car. Dominic stood in the doorway and watched the car go. He looked at the garden. The June morning was warm and clear. The roses along the south wall were in full bloom. He had not noticed they were blooming. He did not know when they had started. He turned and found Kalen standing a few feet behind him, also watching the car. They stood there for a moment, side by side, in the open doorway, and the garden was bright, and the roses were blooming, and neither of them spoke. Then Kalen said, "She is a good person." Dominic said, "She is." Kalen turned and went inside. Dominic stayed in the doorway a moment longer. He thought about the roses. He thought about the months. He thought about the particular sound of Kalen's voice when it was easy and unmanaged, and about the fact that he had stood in a corridor and been stopped by it because it was unfamiliar, and that its unfamiliarity was entirely his own doing. He went inside. The door closed behind him. The house was the same house it had always been, but something in it was different now, or rather, Dominic was different in it. A fraction, the smallest fraction, like a degree of tilt you can barely measure but that changes the direction of everything if you go far enough. He was starting, finally, to look at the thing he had been not looking at for 10 months. In the north wing, Kalen was standing at the window, looking at the garden too. He was thinking about what Sura had said when she shook his hand before leaving. She had said, quietly, "Stay, even when it is hard. Some things take longer than they should. Stay until you know for certain." He was thinking about that word, stay. He was thinking about whether he still had the energy for it. He was not sure yet. But he had not gone anywhere. And the roses were blooming on the south wall, patient as anything, in a garden that no one had tended particularly well, but that kept growing regardless. The journal was not supposed to be on Dominic's desk. This was the thing that Kaylin would think about later, the pure accident of it, the stupid mechanical chance that changed everything. If Bet had not stacked the morning mail on the left instead of the right, if the pile had not shifted when one of the newer staff members came in to leave a package, if the journal had been in the drawer where Kaylin almost always kept it except on the evenings when he brought it down to the sitting room and forgot to bring it back up. If any single one of those things had been different. But they were not different. And at 7:40 on a Tuesday morning in July, Dominic came into his study and found a stack of correspondence on his desk, with a dark green journal sitting on top of it, slightly battered at the corners, with the letter C pressed into the cover, in the way of something done privately, and without flourish. He set it aside without opening it. He worked through the first hour of his morning. He dealt with 3 letters, reviewed a report on the water management project, and spoke by phone with Everton about the upcoming regional summit. The journal sat at the corner of his desk, where he had moved it without thinking. At some point he picked it up. He did not open it immediately. He held it for a moment, aware that he was holding something that was not his. He was not the kind of person who read other people's private things. He set it down. He went back to the water management report. He picked it up again. He set it down. He sat for a moment. Then he opened it. He told himself he would read a line or two, confirm it was Kaylin's, set it aside for returning. This was what he told himself. The first page was dated the week Kaylin had arrived. The handwriting was even and clear. Not careful, just naturally legible, the writing of someone who had written a great deal over many years, and whose hand had settled into its own particular shape. The first entry was about the estate, the size of the corridors, the quality of the light in the morning room, the kindness of the housekeeper. A note about the horses, visible through the garden gate, who had looked at him with what he described as reasonable suspicion. Dominic almost smiled at that. He turned a few pages. October, November. The entries were quiet, observational, the way Kaylin was observational. He wrote about the territory's history, about what he was reading, about small things that had caught his attention. He wrote about the first frost, and the way it changed the garden overnight, from green to silver, as if the world had simply decided to be different. He wrote, in late November, dinner tonight was quiet. He told me about the Northern District flooding. I asked him about the families affected. He did not know, but he made a note. I think he actually followed up on it. I think, underneath all the management, there is a person who genuinely cares about people. I am trying to learn the difference between when I am seeing that person and when I am seeing the manager. Most of the time it is the manager. Dominic sat with that for a while. He turned more pages. December, January. The tone began to shift, so gradually that you would not notice if you were reading quickly. There was still careful observation, still thoughtfulness, but there were also gaps, moments where Kaylin had clearly tried to write something and then not written it, or had written something and crossed it out. He found one crossing out that he could still partially read. It looked like, I wonder if he thinks about. The rest was gone. February, March. He read the entry about the Saturday evening, the sitting room, the grandmother's card game and the smile. Kaylin had written, I think I saw him tonight. Not the king. The person. He was there for an hour, and then his phone went off, and he left, and I sat in the sitting room alone, and thought about the gap between who someone is, and who they have to be, and I wondered which one he prefers. Dominic read this twice. He turned to April. The state dinner. He found the entry for that night, the one Kaylin had written after coming upstairs, the one that had begun with the intention of saying a true thing, and then crossed out the scorekeeping, and said instead, I am tired this evening. That is all. I am just tired. He could still see the ghost of the crossed-out line below the writing. He put the journal down and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. He picked it back up. May, June. The entries here were more spacious, longer, more reflective. The walking, the small room. Bet. A long entry about Surah, about what it had been like to talk to someone who asked real questions and stayed for the answers. And then, near the end of June, an entry that was short. It said, "He stood in the garden doorway this morning, looking at the roses. I do not think he knew they were blooming until today. I think there is a lot he has not noticed. I think some of it is about the roses, and most of it is not. I am trying to decide how long I can live in a house with a person who is genuinely good and genuinely absent, and whether those two things together are enough, and I keep coming back to the same answer, which I am not yet ready to write down." There was a pause in the handwriting, a visible pause, the kind where you put the pen down and sit with something. Then below, in the same ink but slightly steadier, "I think I forgot what it feels like to be looked at, not examined, not presented, not observed across a room at a diplomatic dinner, just looked at, the way you look at someone when you want to know what is behind their face." That was the last entry. Dominic sat very still. The study was absolutely quiet. Outside the window, the July morning was getting on with its business. Birds, a light wind, the distant sound of someone on the grounds, the ordinary noise of a well-running estate. He read the last paragraph again. He sat there for a long time. He did not know exactly what he felt. That was unusual for him. He was generally a man who could locate and name his feelings with reasonable precision, because he had disciplined himself to process things efficiently and move on. But this feeling did not have a clean name. It was several things at once. Shame was in there, which he acknowledged. A particular kind of grief was in there too. Not grief for a loss, but for something that was still present, and that he had been standing next to for 11 months without properly looking at. There was something else too. Beneath the shame and the grief, something that had been there for a long time, without him giving it any acknowledgement. Something that had been trying to get his attention since at least March, since the night in the sitting room, since the evening in the garden corridor when he had stopped because Kaylin's voice had sounded easy in a way he had never heard it sound with him. He wanted to know what was behind Kaylin's face. He had wanted to for months. He had been doing everything possible to avoid finding out. He closed the journal carefully. He thought about all the things he did not know about the person who had been living in his house for nearly a year. He thought about the South Valley drainage system that Kaylin had been studying on his own. He thought about the 43 names. He thought about the cold tray of food left outside the office door on a late winter evening. He stood up. He did not think about what he was going to say. He understood, somewhere in the part of him that was most honest, that if he thought about what to say, he would organize it into something shaped and controlled, and that this was not what was needed. What was needed was the thing underneath the organization. He walked out of the study. He went through the ground floor, up the main staircase, toward the north wing. He stopped outside the door. He had never stood outside this door before. Not once in 11 months. The door was pale wood, unremarkable, with a small handle. There was nothing significant about it, except that it was the one door in this house that led to the person he had been systematically failing to reach for almost a year. He knocked. There was a pause. Then Kaylin's voice said, "Come in." Dominic opened the door. Kaylin was at the small writing desk by the window. He had his journal open. Not writing, just sitting with it, as if he had picked it up without thinking. When the door opened, he looked up with the steady, calm expression he had learned to wear in all interactions in this house. The expression that gave nothing away, that was present without being open. That was the face of a person who had learned not to expect much, and had made a reasonable peace with that. He looked at Dominic. Then he looked past him, at the open door, as if checking what kind of visit this was. Dominic came in. He did not close the door behind him, because closing it would have felt like a declaration, and he did not want to make declarations. He wanted to make something truer than a declaration. He stood in the room. He looked at Kaylin. Not past him, not at some middle distance. At him. The desk was small, and the chair beside it was the one Bet had moved to the window so the light was right. The room was warm, and well lived in a way that Dominic had never seen it, because he had never been in it. There were books everywhere, not disorganized, but present, the way books are in the rooms of people who read seriously. There was a throw over the chair by the door. There was a water glass and a cold cup of tea, and the small particular organization of a private life that had been made without anyone else's input or attention. He had never been in this room. He had lived in this house for 11 months with this person, and he had never once come to this room. He held out the journal. Kaylin looked at it. Then he looked at Dominic's face. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. Kalen did not do dramatic, but something changed, a slight adjustment, like a person who has been holding a position for a long time and has just felt the ground shift beneath them and is not yet sure whether to move or stay still. He took the journal. He said, quietly, "How much did you read?" Dominic said, "Enough." Kalen looked at the journal in his hands. He set it on the desk. He was very still in the way of someone who is managing several things at once. What he knew, what he felt about it, and the question of what to do with the fact that both of those things were now in the room with another person. Dominic sat down in the chair by the door, not because he planned to, but because his legs felt uncertain, in a way they rarely did. This was new information about himself. He said, "I do not know where to start." Kalen said, "That is fine." The words were simple, and they were not cold. They were the words of someone who was giving him space without giving him an escape route. Dominic looked at him. He said, "I have not been here." Kalen said nothing. He said, "I have been in this house. I have been at the same table. I have been to the same events, but I have not been present, in the way that matters." He said, "The drainage system. Gerald told me at the council dinner that you knew about the South Valley drainage system. I did not know you had been studying the territory." Kalen said, "You did not ask." The same 3 words, the same even tone. Not a weapon, just true. Dominic said, "No, I did not. I should have asked a long time ago. I should have asked you about a great many things." He said, "I want to know you. I want to understand what you have been building here, in this house, in this life. I want to know what you think about when you read, and what you care about." He stopped. He said, "I want to look at you properly." For the first time. The room was very quiet. Kalen was looking at him. His expression was complicated. Not closed, not open in the way it used to be, before the months had taught him caution. Something in between, the expression of a person who is hearing something they wanted very much for a long time, and who has learned, in the waiting, to be careful about what they let themselves feel. He said, "That would have been good to know 9 months ago." Dominic said, "Yes, it would." Kalen was quiet. He said, "I am tired, Dominic." He said it without anger, just plainly. He said, "I am tired of being in a room where no one is facing my direction. I stopped looking up when you came in. I stopped expecting things. I learned not to." He paused. He said, "That was my way of surviving this. It was not noble. It was just practical." Dominic said, "I know." He said, "I do not know what I can do about the months. I cannot give them back. I know that." Kalen said, "No, you cannot." They sat in the morning light, in the room Dominic had never been in the quiet of a house that had needed this conversation for a long time. Dominic said, "Can I ask you something?" Kalen said, "You can ask." He said, "Are you still here? Not physically. I know you are here physically, but is there anything left that I have not?" He ran out of words. Kalen looked at him for a long moment. He said, "I do not know yet." Those 4 words were the most honest thing Dominic had ever been given. Not reassurance, not forgiveness, not a door slamming, just the truth of where things were, held out with both hands. He took them. He said, "That is fair." Kalen said, "Yes, it is." Outside the window, the estate garden moved quietly in the warm July air. Inside the room, 2 people sat in the particular silence of a thing that has finally been named, which is different from the silence that comes before naming, heavier in some ways, lighter in others, and pointing, very tentatively, in a direction that had been there all along. The day after that conversation was a Wednesday, and it was deeply ordinary. Dominic went to his meetings. Kalen went for his morning walk. The household ran. The correspondence arrived. The estate continued to be exactly what it was, a large, well-managed, beautiful property, in which 2 people were trying to figure out, without any instruction or precedent, how to be different from what they had been. What changed was small. At first it was almost imperceptibly small. Dominic asked a question at dinner. Not about the territory or the events calendar or the practical administration of their shared life. He said, "What are you reading right now?" Kalen looked at him for a moment before answering. "Just a moment, the reflex of someone checking whether the question was genuine. He said, "A history of the trade routes through this region, specifically the inland water routes from the 15th to the 18th century. Dominic said, "I did not know there were inland water routes here in the 15th century." Kalen said, "Most people do not. The rivers were deeper then. Decades of farming upstream changed the water table." Dominic said, "How did you find that out?" Kalen said, "There is a section in the regional archive that almost nobody visits. Bet told me about it in March." Dominic said, "I did not know about that section." Kalen said, "No, you have been busy. Not sharp, just true." Dominic said, "Can I see the book?" Kalen looked at him again. Then he got up and brought the book from the side table and set it in front of Dominic, open to the page he had been on. Dominic read the page. He said, "This is remarkable." Kalen said, "Yes, it is." They talked about the book for 15 minutes. Then dinner ended, as it usually did, and they moved on with the evening. But something had shifted, the way the temperature of a room shifts when someone opens a window, not dramatically, just a slight change in the quality of the air. The following days brought more small things. Dominic began coming to breakfast without his phone. This was a significant adjustment that nobody commented on directly, though Bet noticed, and filed it in the same place she filed everything. He sat at the table and ate, and when Kalen was there, talked to him. Not always about consequential things. Sometimes about small things. The weather, the garden, something he had read. The kind of things people talk about when they are practicing being in the same space. Kalen received these conversations with the careful attention of someone who was not yet sure what to do with them. He did not pull back. He also did not rush toward them. He was testing, in the quiet way of someone who has been hurt by a version of something and wants to understand whether this is the same version or a different one. On the Friday of that week, Dominic came to the small sitting room in the evening. He had not planned to. He had been heading toward his study and had, at the junction in the corridor, simply gone the other way. He stood in the doorway of the small sitting room, where Kalen was reading, and Kalen looked up, and Dominic said, "I do not want to disturb you. I thought I might read in here, if that is all right." Kalen looked at him for a moment. He said, "There is room." Dominic got a book from the shelf, the one nearest the door, chosen without particular thought, and sat in the other chair, and they read. They did not talk. The evening passed in the kind of quiet that is different from the silence of two people in separate wings of a large house. This quiet had company in it. At 9, Kalen set his book down and stretched and said, "Good night." Dominic looked up. He said, "Good night." Kalen left. Dominic sat in the quiet room for a little while. He thought about the quality of the evening. He thought about how little had happened and how much it had cost, somehow, not in effort, but in attention. He had been present, for 2 hours, in a way that did not require him to perform or decide or manage anything, just present. He had forgotten, somewhere in the years of building himself into the shape of a king, that presence was its own kind of work, that it took something, and gave something back. He went to bed later than usual. He slept better than he had in months. What happened over the weeks that followed was incremental, and sometimes painful, and occasionally clumsy in the way of any two people trying to learn each other's rhythms after having spent a long time deliberately not doing so. Dominic made mistakes. He overcorrected in the early days, tried too hard, asked too many questions, filled silences that Kalen was comfortable in, and Kalen had said, gently but plainly, "You do not have to fill every gap. I do not mind the quiet." He undercorrected after that, pulled back too far, went 2 days without initiating anything, and Kalen had looked at him across the breakfast table on the third morning with an expression that said, without words, "I see what you are doing, and it is not what I meant." He learned, slowly, in the way of someone who is genuinely trying to understand something new rather than to manage it into shape. He learned that Kalen preferred the morning for reading and the evenings for conversation. He learned that Kalen's particular laugh, the real one, the full one, came most reliably when something genuinely caught him off guard, and that it could not be produced by effort. He learned that Kalen had strong opinions about agricultural policy, and almost none about social events, and that the reverse was true for Dominic, and that this meant they had more complementary knowledge than either of them had realized. He learned that Kalen missed his family, in the way of someone who loved them and was far from them, and had not wanted to add that weight to everything else he was carrying. He called his mother on Sunday mornings, a fact that Dominic discovered by accident, and then, without making it a thing, arranged to have those Sunday mornings kept free of any household demands. Kalen noticed. He said nothing about it for 2 weeks. Then one Sunday evening he came to the study where Dominic was working and said, "Thank you for the mornings." Dominic looked up. He said, "Of course." Kalen nodded and went back upstairs. Dominic sat at his desk and felt the specific satisfaction of having done a small thing right, not a large gesture, not a declaration. A small, considered thing that served someone without requiring acknowledgement. It was not nothing. He began to understand that it was, actually, everything. In the north wing, Kalen sat at his writing desk and opened his journal to the first blank page after the last entry. He wrote, "Something is different. I do not want to say more than that yet. I am being careful, because I have learned what it costs to be not careful. But something is different." He wrote, "I am still tired. I want to be honest about that. I am tired in a way that does not go away quickly. The way you are tired after you have been holding something heavy for a long time, and you have finally put it down but your arms still remember the weight." He wrote, "But I am still here. That counts for something. I am still here, and I am still looking. And today, for the first time in a long time, I think the person across from me was looking too." He closed the journal. He thought, "Stay." That was what Surah had said. Stay until you know for certain. He did not yet know for certain, but he was staying. Dominic asked Everton to clear his schedule on a Saturday in August. This was unprecedented enough that Everton stared at him for a full 3 seconds before writing it down. He did not explain why. He simply said, "Saturday. Nothing before noon, please." Everton said, "Is everything all right?" Dominic said, "Yes. I want to do something." On Saturday morning he was up before 7. He went through the garden in the early light, stopped at the south wall, and looked at the roses, past their bloom now, past everything, but the plants themselves were healthy, and the hips were beginning to form, small and red-orange, the way they did at the end of summer. He had been looking at these roses for weeks now, not with the vague inattention with which he had failed to notice them for the first 10 months of living here, but with actual attention. He had learned, from asking Bet, when they were planted, and by which family, and what they were called. A variety called Mrs. Walter Coles, which sounded like the name of someone's grandmother, and was exactly right for that. He went inside. He went upstairs. He knocked on the north wing door. Kalen opened it. He looked at Dominic with that measured expression that always now contained, behind it, something less measured, something that was deciding how much of itself to show. Dominic said, "Would you come somewhere with me today?" Kalen said, "Where?" Dominic said, "The archive. The section Bet told you about, in the regional library. I would like to see it." A pause. Kalen said, "You cleared your Saturday for the archive?" Dominic said, "And wherever else we end up." Another pause. Kalen said, "Give me 10 minutes." He came back in 8. They walked out through the garden, past the south wall roses, to where the car was waiting, and Dominic told the driver, "The regional library, please. And then we will see." They spent 4 hours in the regional archive. It was not a dramatic 4 hours. They moved through the old shelves and the flat files and the document cases with the absorbed quiet of 2 people who are genuinely interested in what they are looking at. Kalen showed him the section Bet had described, a corner of the archive full of records from the 16th and 17th centuries that had been sorted, but not yet catalogued into the main system. Dominic was immediately absorbed. He said, "This is extraordinary." Kalen said, "I thought you would think so." They spent an hour on a single map, an old trade route document showing the network of small waterways that had once served as the region's main transport system. They argued, in the mild and interested way of 2 people who both have opinions, about where the central junction point would have been based on the geography. Kalen thought the south branch. Dominic thought the east. The librarian, an elderly man named Clement, who came to check on them twice, and then gave up pretending he was not listening, eventually offered that the most recent scholarly work suggested a third location that neither of them had considered. All 3 of them spent 20 minutes looking at the evidence for Clement's point. Clement was correct. Dominic bought him a cup of tea from the cafe down the road as an acknowledgement of this. They ate lunch at a small place 2 streets from the library. The chairs were wooden and slightly mismatched, and the menu was short, and everything on it was good. They sat across from each other at a table by the window, and Dominic looked at Kaylin in the afternoon light of a town they did not usually visit, doing something they did not usually do, and thought, here he is. Here is the person who has been in the North Wing all this time. Kaylin said, you are staring. Dominic said, I am. Kaylin looked at him. He said, stop. But the corner of his mouth had moved slightly. After lunch, they walked along the main street without particular destination. Kaylin stopped at a second-hand bookshop, and Dominic followed him in, and they spent 40 minutes in there. He bought 2 things, a 19th-century survey of the region's geology, and a small battered guide to rose cultivation that he thought Bet might find useful. Or, he admitted to himself privately, that he might find useful. Kaylin bought a book about cartography. On the drive home, the late afternoon was golden on the fields, and they sat in the back of the car and talked about the archive and the map and the third location theory, and somewhere in the conversation it moved into other things, the territory's relationship with its own history, the kinds of decisions people make about what to preserve and what to let go. Kaylin said, that is what I have been trying to do here, in some ways, understand the place after the fact. Dominic said, the estate? Kaylin said, the estate, the bond, all of it. He was looking out the window. He said, I have been reading about the territory and its history because it felt like a way of building something real to stand on, something that was mine, something that did not depend on something else. Dominic said, on me. Kaylin did not answer immediately. Then he said, I was not trying to replace what was not there. I was just trying to build something that was actually there. Does that make sense? Dominic said, yes. He said, I am sorry it was necessary. Kaylin turned to look at him. He said, you keep apologizing. Dominic said, yes. Kaylin said, I know, I hear it. I am not asking you to stop. I just want you to know that I hear it. The car moved through the golden afternoon. The estate appeared on the hill ahead, familiar and large, and lit warmly by the late sun. They came through the gates and up the drive, and the car stopped and they got out, and the evening air was warm and smelled of the garden. They stood in the drive for a moment. Kaylin said, thank you. For today. Dominic said, thank you for coming. Kaylin nodded. He went inside. Dominic stood in the drive, looking up at the house, at the windows of the north wing, where the lights were on and warm. He went inside. He knocked on the kitchen door and found Bet and gave her the book about roses. She looked at it. She looked at him. She said nothing, for once, which was itself a kind of comment. He went upstairs. The north wing was quiet. The light under the door was still on. He stood in the corridor for a moment. He did not knock. Not yet. They were not there yet. There was more to build and more to understand, and the caution Kaylin carried in him, earned, reasonable, honest caution, deserved to be respected at its own pace. But he stood there a moment, and felt, in the thin thread of the bond between them, something he had not felt in it before. Not just the absence of loss, something more than that. Something beginning. October arrived the way it does in that part of the country, overnight, all at once, as if summer had simply made a decision, and autumn had immediately shown up to take the room. Dominic noticed the change. He noticed it the way he had begun to notice everything that season, not just as background information, but with actual attention, the quality of the light in the morning room, the particular color the old trees in the garden went, one turning before the others, the crispness that arrived in the corridor near the side door that faced north. He had started walking in the evenings. This had happened gradually, without announcement. First once, near the end of August, when the evening had been warm, and he had found himself in the garden without particularly meaning to be. Then a few times the following week. Then, without either of them explicitly arranging it, he had found himself walking the same route Kaylin had been walking for months. They did not always walk together. Sometimes Dominic came out to find Kaylin already heading back in. Sometimes Kaylin was in the north wing by the time Dominic went out. But sometimes the timing aligned, and they walked the same route in the same direction. and they talked or they did not, and both felt natural. In those weeks, Dominic learned more about Kaylin than he had in the entire preceding year. He learned that Kaylin had wanted to be a teacher when he was young, secondary school, history. He had spent 2 years toward that, before deciding to move in a different direction, but the interest had stayed. He talked about history the way teachers do, not as information but as story, as consequence, as the living result of choices people made under pressure. He learned that Kaylin was afraid of heights, not terrified, just the specific unease of someone who can walk across a bridge and is perfectly fine, and also is not perfectly fine. He learned that Kaylin had a habit of making tea and then forgetting to drink it until it was cold, and then drinking it cold anyway, because he did not like waste. This was a thing that Dominic had apparently watched happen dozens of times at dinner, and never registered until he was paying attention. He learned that Kaylin laughed differently at different things, a short, surprise sound when something caught him off guard, a longer, quieter one when something settled amusingly into the course of a conversation, and the full one, the one that Dominic had first heard through a corridor wall, which required something that struck him as genuinely, delightfully unexpected. Dominic worked, over those weeks, to be the kind of person who could produce that third kind. He succeeded, twice. Both times he had not been trying. Both times it had come from something that was genuinely funny, rather than from effort. He noted this. He stopped trying and started just being present, which was harder and also worked better. Kaylin was watching all of this with the careful attention of someone who has decided, provisionally, to let themselves be cautiously open to something. He had not made a declaration. He was watching the evidence accumulate and trying to assess it honestly, rather than through either optimism or the armor of caution. He was still tired. That had not fully resolved. The specific exhaustion of a long stretch of emotional loneliness does not disappear in a month of better mornings. It goes slowly, the way bone heals, from the inside, not visible to anyone, and slower than you want it to be. But there were evenings. That was what he would say, if asked, about that autumn. There were evenings. Evenings in the small sitting room where they both read. Evenings where the conversation found its own length and ended when it was done. Evenings where Dominic said something about whatever he was reading, and Kaylin responded, and it became something else. Not a scheduled conversation, not a managed exchange, but just two people in a room who were genuinely interested in each other's thinking. Kaylin had not stopped being cautious, but he had started, occasionally, being warm. Small warmth, the kind that lives in small things. Leaving the sitting room lamp on when he went to make tea in case Dominic wanted to read. Mentioning things he thought Dominic would find interesting. An article, a piece of news from the region, a thing Bet had told him. Saying good morning in the mornings with actual presence behind it, rather than just as a word that needed to be said. Dominic noticed all of it. He received it with a restraint that cost him something, the restraint of not rushing, not reaching too fast, not trying to make more of these small offerings than they were. He understood, now, that Kaylin had been offering things for months in the early days, and he had not received them. He was receiving now. He was not going to ruin receiving by turning it into demanding. One evening in mid-October, they were in the sitting room. The fire was going because the evenings had turned cold. Dominic was reading his geology survey. Kaylin was reading the cartography book. The room was very comfortable. Kaylin said, without looking up, "My brother is getting married in December." Dominic lowered his book. Kaylin said, "The older one, Neil. He has been with his partner for 6 years." Dominic said, "That is wonderful." Kaylin said, "It is in the West Country. 3 days." He paused. He said, "I was not sure whether to mention it because I did not know if you would." He stopped. Dominic said, "I would like to come." Kaylin looked up. Dominic said, "If that is appropriate. If you want me to. I would like to meet your family." Kaylin looked at him steadily. He said, "My mother will ask you about 30 questions." Dominic said, "I am told I am good with councils and committees. I will manage 30 questions." The corner of Kaylin's mouth moved. He said, "She will want to know what you eat and whether you sleep enough." Dominic said, "Accurate questions, I suspect." Kaylin said, "Fair." He looked back at his book. After a moment he said, "I will let Neil know we are both coming. We are both coming." Dominic did not say anything about those 3 words. He simply said, "Good," and looked back at his geology survey. But he read the same sentence 4 times without absorbing it. November came, and with it a week that Dominic thought about for a long time afterward. It began with a phone call, a senior council member with a question about a policy matter that should have been simple and turned into 2 days of complicated navigation. He was in his study most of both days, deeply immersed in the kind of problem that required his full and focused attention, and by Wednesday evening, he was tired in the specific way of someone who has been running a very fine instrument at full capacity for too long. He came to dinner late. Kaylin was already there, and there was food kept warm, and Dominic sat down and ate without talking much, and Kaylin let him be quiet in a way that felt, for the first time, like something other than distance. It felt like knowing him. Kaylin refilled his water glass without being asked. He said, at some point in the meal, the West Boundary report came in. Dominic said, "Anything urgent?" Kaylin said, "No. I read it this afternoon. I made some notes. I left them on your desk." Dominic looked up. He said, "You read the Boundary report?" Kaylin said, "I have been following the issue since August. I thought it might be useful." Dominic said, "It is, very." He said, "Thank you." Kaylin said, "It is fine." But there was something in his voice, not pride, something quieter, the satisfaction of someone who has done a useful thing and has had it received properly, rather than overlooked. Dominic said, "I mean it, thank you." Kaylin met his eyes. He said, "I know you do." After dinner, Dominic went back to the study. He found the notes on his desk, 3 pages, in Kaylin's clear, even handwriting, precise and well-organized and genuinely insightful about the issues at stake. He read them twice. He picked up a pen. He wrote, at the bottom of Kaylin's notes, "The east observation is particularly strong. I had not seen this angle. Would you be willing to come to the meeting next week?" He left it on the desk where Kaylin would see it. He went to bed. The bond pulled in the particular way it had been pulling lately, not thin, not strained, something more like a tide coming in, steady, present. He let himself feel it. He did not fight it. He thought about December, about the wedding, about 30 questions from someone's mother, about driving to the West Country with another person and coming back to the same house and putting the kettle on and calling it home. He thought, "I am still learning. I am going to make mistakes. I am going to reach too hard or pull back too much, and there will be evenings when I do not get it right, and there will be days when the weight of what was lost comes back for both of us." He thought, "And I am going to be here for all of those days." He thought, "I am going to be here." He fell asleep. In the north wing, the light was still on. They arrived at the wedding on a Friday afternoon. Neil's partner was a man named Callum, quiet in the way of people who have a tremendous amount going on underneath the surface, and he had pulled Kaylin into a long hug at the front door and said something into his ear that made Kaylin close his eyes for a moment. Dominic had watched from 2 feet away and felt something that was somewhere between relief and shame, the particular mixture that had become, over the recent months, somewhat familiar to him. Relief that Kaylin had this, shame that he had spent a year not understanding how necessary it was. Kaylin's mother, a warm and direct woman named Patricia, had taken one look at Dominic and shaken his hand with both of hers and said, "I have heard a little. I want to hear more." She had asked him 28 questions over the course of the weekend. He had answered all of them honestly, including the ones that were not comfortable. She had looked at him after the second evening, with an expression that was reserved and careful, and that communicated, without words, that she was still deciding. He respected that. He would have been worried if she had not been. The wedding itself was small and completely wonderful. Neil and Callum had been together long enough that the ceremony felt like a formalization of something everyone already knew, and the whole event had the feeling of joy that has been waited for patiently and is now simply present, undramatic and complete. Kaylin stood beside his brother for part of the ceremony. Dominic watched him from his seat. He watched him laugh with his brothers. He watched him sit beside his mother and lean slightly into her, in the way of someone who has missed her and is not pretending otherwise. He watched him be, for 3 days, the full version of himself, the person he was in the sitting room when things were good, but more, the person he was before he had learned to be careful, before the months in a house where no one was looking. He watched him and thought, "This is what I have been doing without." Not just him, This, the full version. He made himself sit with that. On the drive home, on Sunday evening, the countryside was dark, and the car was warm, and Kalen had his head turned toward the window watching the lights of the towns they passed. He was thinking about something. Dominic let him think. After a while, Kalen said, "Thank you for coming." Dominic said, "Thank you for inviting me." Kalen said, "My mother likes you." Dominic said, "She told me she was still deciding." Kalen said, "Yes, that means she likes you. If she had decided she did not, she would have been much warmer." Dominic processed this. He said, "Your family is remarkable." Kalen said, "Yes, they are." He turned from the window. He said, "I had forgotten what it was like to be in it." I was not forgetting them. I just forgot what that particular feeling is, of being fully in a place. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I would like to feel more of that." Dominic said, "Here." Kalen said, "Here." Dominic said, "I want that too." It was not a grand declaration. It was just two people in the back of a car on a Sunday night saying a true thing and meaning it, and neither of them embellishing it, and the car moving through the dark toward the lights of the estate on its hill. When they got back, Dominic put the kettle on. This had become, without anyone deciding it, something he did when they came in late from somewhere. Put the kettle on, make 2 cups, bring them to wherever they settled. Kalen had started accepting the second cup without comment, which itself was a kind of statement. They sat in the small sitting room. The fire was not going because they had been away, but the room still held some warmth from the day. They drank their tea. Kalen said, "What does Everton think about all of this?" Dominic said, "All of what?" Kalen said, "The change, the whatever this is." Dominic said, "He is professionally trying not to look too relieved." Kalen laughed. The full one. Dominic had said it without trying to produce it. It had just been the true and faintly funny description of Everton's manner in recent weeks. And there it was, unplanned, genuine. He thought, "There you are." He did not say it out loud. He was learning which things to say and which to hold. Kalen finished his tea. He said, "I am going to bed." He stood up. He stopped in the doorway. He said, without turning around, "I am glad you came to the wedding." He said it in the way of someone saying more than the words. Dominic said, "So am I." Kalen went upstairs. The house was warm and quiet, and the lights were on, and somewhere in the north wing, a door was still open, in the way that doors are when someone has walked through them and intends to walk through them again. The second ceremony was in January. Nobody called it a ceremony. Kalen, when he mentioned it to Sura in a phone call, called it a conversation, which was technically accurate. Dominic, when he mentioned it to Everton, to explain why his Thursday afternoon was free, called it a personal matter. Bet, who found out from nobody and simply knew in the way that she knew most things in that house, called it about time, and said this to her own kitchen wall where nobody heard her, and then got on with making the tea. What it actually was this. On Thursday afternoon in January, Dominic went to the small sitting room at 3 o'clock. He had asked Kalen, that morning at breakfast, whether they could talk in the afternoon. Kalen had said yes with the careful steadiness that had become his default for things that might matter. Not closed, not open, just honest. The sitting room was as it always was. Good light in the afternoon, the 2 chairs, the fire, which Dominic had started earlier because January was cold. He sat in his chair. Kalen came in and sat in his. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Dominic said, "I wanted to tell you something. I have been trying to figure out how to say it for some time, and I have realized there is not a better way than just saying it." Kalen said, "All right." Dominic said, "I know what happened in the first year. I know what I did and what I did not do, and how it affected you. I am not going to summarize it because you lived it, and you know it better than I can describe it." He paused. He said, "What I want to tell you is what I understand now that I did not understand then." He said, "I understand that you are a person who required looking at, not managing, not accommodating, not including in events or attaching to a bond for practical reasons. Looking at. The kind of looking that means you are actually trying to understand someone." He said, "I did not know how to do that. I thought I did. I thought I was providing what was needed. I was providing what I was comfortable providing, which is completely different and much less." Kalen was listening. Not with his professional listening face, with his actual face. Dominic said, I see you now. Not because of the journal. I need to say that. The journal showed me what I had failed to see, but it did not create the seeing. The seeing happened because I started to look. It happened in conversations, and in the archive, and in the garden, and at the wedding, and in 100 small moments over the last 4 months, where you showed me who you were, and I was actually there to receive it. He said, I see who you are. I want you to know that. He said, and I want you to know that I understand that saying this now, after a year of not saying or being or doing enough of anything, I understand that it does not automatically fix anything. I am not asking you to receive this and give me something back. I am telling you because it is true, and because you deserve to have it said. He stopped. The fire made its small sounds. Kaylin was very still. After a long moment he said, Why now? Why Thursday? Dominic said, Because I have been saying I was going to say this since August, and I kept finding reasons to wait, and I realized this morning that I was going to keep finding reasons to wait, and the truth is, there is not a better time. There is only now, and now is when it is true, and I wanted to stop sitting on a true thing. Kaylin said, Yes. He said, That is a good reason. He looked at the fire for a moment. He said, I want to tell you something too. He said, I spent a long time in this house building things that did not include you. The small room, the walks, the books, the archive section. Not because I was trying to leave you out. I was not. I was just trying to find solid ground, when the ground we were supposed to be on together did not feel like ground. But what I realized, somewhere around October, was that most of what I had been building, I wanted to share it with you. He said, The archive. I wanted you to see the archive. I thought about telling you for weeks before you asked to come. Dominic said, I wish I had asked sooner. Kaylin said, Yes, but you asked. He said, That is what I keep coming back to. You asked, you learned to ask. That is not nothing. That is quite a lot actually, when you understand what it costs you. Dominic said, I do understand. Kaylin said, I know. He said, I am still tired. I want to be honest about that. I am still carrying some of the weight from before. It does not go away, because things get better, but I am carrying it alongside something else now, which makes it different. He said, I see you too. I want you to know that. The person I have been learning for the last 4 months, I see him. And he is not the manager and not the king and not the man who said the arrangement has been a good one in a room full of diplomats. He said, he is someone I would very much like to keep knowing. Dominic looked at him. He said, I would like that too. They sat with it for a moment. The particular weight of 2 people who have said the true thing and are now just in the room with it, which is both lighter and heavier than before. Then Kaylin said, Sura asked me, when I called her, whether I thought you had changed, or whether you had always been this, and just needed more time. Dominic said, What did you tell her? Kaylin said, I told her I thought it was both, that the person was always there, that he just needed someone to require him to be present, and that it took longer than it should have, and cost more than it should have, and that I am glad we got here anyway. Dominic said, I am glad too. He said, I am going to keep getting it wrong sometimes. Kaylin said, I know. He said, I am going to see it when you do. Dominic said, I know. Kaylin said, good. He reached across the space between the chairs, not dramatically, just a small and deliberate reach, and put his hand briefly over Dominic's. Just a moment. Just long enough to be there. Then he took it back. He said, I am going to make tea. Do you want some? Dominic said, yes. Kaylin went to the kitchen. Dominic sat in the sitting room with the fire and the afternoon light and the quiet of a house that was just a house, but that was also, now, something more than that. A place where 2 people were building something real, not perfect, not repaired so completely that you could not see where it had been broken, but real. He looked around the room, the books, the throw on Kaylin's chair, the window with its good light. He thought, I live here. I actually live here. The spring came slowly that year. March arrived with cold rain and stayed with it, and the garden along the south wall was slow to begin. The crocuses were late. The ground held its frost longer than usual. But by the second week of March, something was happening. The careful, unhurried advance of the season that could not be stopped by cold or delay, that worked on its own time, regardless of what was convenient. Dominic had planted things. This was a fact that would have been confusing to anyone who had known him a year and a half ago. In November, Bet had handed him the rose cultivation guide he had bought for her from the bookshop and said, without ceremony, "I know enough about roses. You use this." He had taken it home and read it and made notes in the margins, and in January, with the help of the estate's groundskeeper, a patient and thorough man named Arthur who had been maintaining the grounds for 20 years, and who was graciously tolerant of Dominic's complete lack of experience, he had planted 3 things along the east boundary that were scheduled to bloom in May. Kaylin knew about this because he had seen it happen on a Saturday morning, from the window of the small forgotten room, and had come down to observe. He had not said, "I did not know you gardened." He had said, "What are you planting?" And Dominic had told him, and Arthur had added the technical details, and Kaylin had stood in the cold January garden in his coat and listened, and then he had said, "Let me know when they come up," and had gone back inside. Dominic had thought about that, "let me know," for several days. The easy assumption in it, the future it contained, the understanding, unspoken, that they would both still be here when the flowers came up, that they would be here, and that Dominic would tell him, and Kaylin would come and look. He had thought about how much he wanted that to be true. It was true. The bond between them, which had been fraying for most of a year, which had pulled to a thread and stayed there while the careful months of rebuilding had happened around it, had been growing back, not in the way of something repaired exactly. More in the way of something that had started over at the root and was finding its own new growth, different from what had been there before, without the brittleness of things that were never properly built in the first place. They had not formally marked this. There had been no ceremony, no statement, no particular moment that either of them would have pointed to and said, "There, that was when." It was a gradual and quiet thing, which was, Kaylin would have said, exactly right for what it was. The way trust comes back, not in a rush but in the slow accumulation of ordinary days. Ordinary days that were not, it turned out, ordinary at all. Everton had said, in a Monday briefing in February, with the controlled pleasure of a man who had spent considerable professional effort on a thing and was only now permitting himself to feel good about it, "You seem well." Dominic had looked at him and said, "I am." Everton had nodded once and moved to the next agenda item, and that was the extent of the conversation, which was exactly as much as either of them needed. Patricia had called on the second Sunday in February and spoken to both of them, which she now did regularly. She had told Dominic about a garden she was planning in her backyard. He had told her about the east boundary planting. She had asked for Arthur's advice on bulb selection, and he had passed the phone to Arthur, who had been in the garden at the time, and Arthur had had a 15-minute conversation with Patricia that Dominic and Kaylin had listened to from the kitchen doorway with their tea. It was one of the best 15 minutes Dominic could remember in some time. He told Kaylin this afterward. Kaylin had said, "My mother has strong feelings about bulbs." Dominic said, "I am beginning to understand that." He said, "I like her very much." Kaylin had looked at him and then said, simply, "I know. She knows too." The months had found a rhythm that was theirs, not forced, not managed. Just the natural rhythm of two people who had learned each other's habits and worked around them and alongside them without it being a project. Dominic still had full days. He still worked long hours on the complicated things that required his full attention. The territory had problems that did not pause for personal developments. He dealt with them with the same focused competence he had always brought to them, and now he came home from the difficult weeks and found, in the sitting room, a person who knew the shape of difficult weeks and did not require an explanation, and also did not let him completely disappear into them. Kaylin had started a project. He had gone back to the regional archive, first alone and then with Dominic on a Saturday, and then alone again, and he was working on something with Clement the librarian and Arthur, and a historian from the nearest university, a proper documentation of the Inland Water Routes project. It was voluntary and entirely his own. He came home from the archive days with ink-stained fingers and the particular energized quiet of someone who has spent a day on something meaningful. Dominic had offered resources. Kaylin had said, "Let me see how far I get first." Dominic had said, "Of course. Let me know when you are ready." This was how they operated now. Room to work. Support when asked. Attention that was present without being a weight. The flowers came up in May. Dominic saw them first, on a Tuesday morning, coming back from an early walk. 3 small but insistent blooms along the east boundary, where the planting had gone in on a cold January Saturday. He went inside. He found Kaylin at the breakfast table. He said, "The east boundary." Kaylin looked up. He said, "Already?" Dominic said, "3 of them." Kaylin stood up. They walked out together through the side door and around the garden path to the east boundary, and there they were, 3 flowers, modest and certain, in exactly the spot where Dominic had put them in the cold. Kaylin stood beside him and looked at them. He said, "You actually got them to grow." Dominic said, "Arthur did most of it." Kaylin said, "You were there every week." Dominic said, "It was a reasonable thing to care about." Kaylin looked at him. He said, "Yes, it was." They stood there for a few minutes in the May morning, beside the flowers on the east boundary, in the old garden that kept growing regardless of who was paying attention. This was the shape of the thing they had built, not grand, not without its difficult history, not a love story that started at the beginning and went straight and clean to the end. A love story that started wrong and got lost and found itself, slowly, in ordinary Tuesday mornings and patient Wednesday evenings, and the small daily work of 2 people deciding, over and over, to turn toward each other, to look. Dominic had learned to look. He was still learning. He would be learning for a long time, but the looking had started, and the looking had changed everything. And standing here in the garden on a May morning beside a person he had spent a year failing to see, and the last 6 months learning to see properly, he could feel the difference in the weight of the day, in the quality of the light, in the bond between them, which was no longer thin or strained or pulled to the limit of its patience, but strong and present and warm and going forward. Kaylin said, "We should have breakfast." He turned toward the house. He reached back, briefly, and touched Dominic's arm. Just a light touch, just a moment, just a small and certain thing. And then he walked on. Dominic stayed a moment longer. He looked at the flowers. He looked at the garden, which was full of things coming back. He looked at the house, with its morning windows lit and warm, and the door open, where Kaylin had gone through it. He thought, "I am here." He thought, "I see it all." He followed him in.